Welcome to Beyond the Limit, a podcast exploring the wild world of wellness and the quest for peak performance. Hosted by myself, Dr. Matt, and my esteemed colleague, Dr. Mike. Each episode we will be digging into the health fads, the medical breakthroughs and the science of performance, giving our audience credible insight into what works and, well, what simply doesn't. Welcome, Mike. I'm excited to get started with our first episode. We're exploring the shady underworld of psychedelics. As a brief kind of overview, just to get us started straight off the bat, psychedelics, there's a kind of broad umbrella term, isn't it? But they're defined as the drugs that produce hallucinations or an apparent expansion of consciousness. And this is an incredibly interesting topic, I think, with the relevant and recent developments in the medical sphere and the use cases for psychedelics. And I'm keen to know what your thoughts are. Before we did any research, did you have any kind of thoughts or feelings around psychedelics?
Well, hi Matt, first of all, really great to be here. I'm really excited about this, and thanks for the introduction. I don't often get called esteemed, so I will take that every week. Really excited to be talking about psychedelics, and I think in answer to your question, I must confess and admit to potentially a little bit of bias on this, in the sense that it's an area, and particularly the area, the focus on its role in medical treatments, that's fascinated me for a while. Actually, every time the kind of research comes out or there are articles written about it, it's an area that I am quite hopeful about. So those were kind of my feelings beforehand. I don't know about yourself, if you shared those, or whether this was all very new.
Yeah, hopeful is an interesting word, isn't it? I think there's so much unknown and uncertainty, and potentially some hubris around the topic in terms of what it can deal with and the implications of these medications. That I guess there is hope around it, but it's definitely still a mysterious kind of shady corner of medicine.
I think that's really fair, and actually, as I think we'll keep returning to with this series, hopefully, is that it's really difficult sometimes with these fads or these novel treatments to cut through all the claims, all the advertising, and quite frankly, all the bullshit, to try and work out whether they're effective or not. So hopefully we'll be able to navigate our listeners better through that uncertainty and as we said, separate fact from fiction.
So what I'll do next is I should probably outline that we're going to be quite specific in terms of what we mainly focus on today, because psychedelics have many forms. There is psilocybin, there's also obviously LSD, DMT, ketamine. There's a whole kind of raft of names and acronyms that represent psychoactive substances, some of which are kind of organically grown in murder on trees, plants that you find in the Amazon jungle, whereas others are synthetically made, such as LSD, synthetically made in clinical labs. I think what we're focusing on today is the psilocybin. And I don't know if you, Mike, if you want to give a bit of a summary of the history of where psilocybin was discovered.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, because I wouldn't normally say that the history of any medication is hugely fascinating, but actually, in terms of psilocybin, the history of it does read a little bit like an Indiana Jones film script. If I take you back to the South American Aztec Indian times, this is where psilocybin first was found and mentioned. It was referred to as something called Teonanacatl. Pronunciation may well be completely wrong there. This essentially means God's flesh, and they used it, by all accounts. Some Spanish missionaries didn't like the idea of this being used or this being remembered, so they attempted to destroy all evidence of it in the 1500s. Fortunately for mushroom fans and for the content of the remainder of this podcast, a Spanish Franciscan historian had referenced it extensively in his writings, and that's really where the interest in this arose again. So if we then fast forward to the 1950s, there's this magazine in the US called Life magazine. They wrote an article called The Search for the Magic Mushroom. And this really piqued the interest in those in the Western world. So there's an American psychologist by the name of Timothy Leary. He traveled to Mexico to experience the substance himself. And when he came back to Harvard University, he slightly controversially started conducting experiments on prisoners, the effect on so-called recidivism. Actually, the results from that studies were fairly startling, and it did suggest that there was something here. However, soon after that, potentially because of the trials, I'm not sure, this guy Leary lost his job, and it moved more towards the kind of US hippie community. And I guess that's where if you say shrooms or magic mushrooms to someone, that's often where their mind will go. So they were made illegal in the US in 71. They remain a Class A drug in the UK, and that's a really important factor to consider throughout all of this conversation, I think. And I think we are going to talk, I think, about some of the risks related to that and why it's got that Class A rating.
I think it conjures up amazing images in my mind of these Spanish conquistadores discovering new territory and new lands. And given in mind that these were people with very kind of strict religious beliefs, traditional religious beliefs, discovering these heretics that seemingly had no religion but would conjure up these kind of these voodoo kind of ceremonial events, pray to deities that seemed completely otherworldly. And I think there's some interesting kind of insight studying that as well. The idea of them believing in these sorcerers and these gods that could change, shapeshift and change into animals and things, and then discovering these like mushroom-shaped relics that were representing this ceremonial aspect of their belief, and how they kind of gather and take this psychoactive substance that could almost create this almost a religion or this other world, and how you'd want to banish that as a traditional thinker.
I think that's a really fair point. What I took away from it really was the fact that the psilocybin and magic mushrooms, we're sort of using those synonymously here, but there was evidence, or it was sort of fairly widely known that they may have a role here in treating various medical conditions, primarily mental health problems. But it really just kind of got taken over by the recreational side of things, by the hippie community, and as a result, sort of stringent measures were brought in, and it was banned, and that's where it all got a little bit lost in terms of the research. So, and I think as I said, we'll get onto this, but it's only really been recently in the last sort of 5 to 10 years where looking at those potential medicinal advantages have really come back into the conversation.
And let's get on to that. So I guess to kind of take this further, we do need to get a bit geeky in terms of what psilocybin actually is. So humour me for the next 5 minutes. But researching this further, so this psilocybin is actually kind of converted to the active form of something called psilocin in the gut. This is the active chemical that is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Why that's important is that when it's ingested, it goes into the blood. To get to the brain, it has to kind of get there, and it's the psilocin that gets there. Now, what does it actually do when it gets there? Now, this is what I find really interesting in that it binds to the receptors in the brain called the serotonin 2A receptors. Now, they're a specific form of serotonin receptors, and I think most people probably have some awareness of the word serotonin and it kind of being associated with this kind of happy hormone. But essentially, it's a neurotransmitter, and the psilocin quite strongly and competitively binds to these 2A receptors, and that has numerous implications, which I think could be easily understood for anyone who's seen the traditional films about people having hallucinogenic mushroom trips. But these receptors typically kind of they trigger senses of pleasure, satiety, motivation, but they're intrinsically linked to a very complicated network of neurotransmitters, which I think need to work in harmony, almost like this kind of orchestra, which are involving kind of the dopamine, the noradrenaline, the glutamine, serotonin, all of these neurotransmitters. And I think trying to simplify it down into if you ingest this, it causes this, I think is an oversimplification. I think that's commonly an oversimplification that's made in anecdotes of cause and effect. But the active, the results of kind of taking taking psilocin or having psilocin is that it does activate what can be relatively dormant pathways in the brain and can lead to incredibly complex and unexpected new networks forming. And I think this term of neuroplasticity, this kind of adaptive learning of the brain in response to new pathways being stimulated, is a theory that's often kind of put forward when taking magic mushrooms. Now, I caveat that by saying this is an incredibly complicated subject, and also that the brain is probably the most poorly understood organ of the body, despite modern science.
I think that's a good caveat to mention. I think these are theories, aren't they, in terms of the actual way in which they work. But I think that's really interesting when you say that, because we might discuss this a little bit about people's experience when they've taken psilocybin, how they feel, or what the suggestion is that this unlocks. And that, I think that plays in quite nicely to your description there.
Yeah. And to further your point there, one of the kind of simple observations that people often say is that they hallucinate. They see things, they see distortion of shapes, or they see new shapes, colours, etc. And some of the science to back that up is that one of the areas of the brain that's heavily populated with serotonin 2A receptors is the visual cortex. And that we're fully aware that when people take the substance, that they start to see new shapes, slurring and moving objects. Even when their eyes are closed, they're seeing these things that aren't actually happening, and that's kind of in response to those hallucinations. But anyway, I probably want to pick your brains a little bit more, because I know that you've been looking into the default mode network.
Yeah, and it's something that I've been interested in for a little while, actually, in a different realm of medicine initially. But in terms of, there are two networks in the brain that are actually worth considering. So there's the default mode network that you've just referred to, and psilocybin has been shown to potentially modulate this default mode network, and this region is linked with self-referential thought processes, potentially daydreaming, contemplation. And then you've got the other network to consider, which is the central executive network, and this is involved with the ability to focus, essentially. So these networks should be working in turn rather than together. What they've shown is, if you look at functional MRI scanning of patients who have particularly significant mood disorders or PTSD, they show that the default mode network and the central executive network are essentially firing at the same time. So there's potentially something quite interesting in terms of the way this works. Interestingly, when we talk about kind of experts in mindfulness, meditation, your classic Buddhist monk who's an expert in doing that, they've been shown in functional MRIs that they can shut off their default mode network, and hence, I guess that's the basis of sort of mindfulness and meditation. And the feeling is that psilocybin potentially has the same effect.
Okay. Talking about potential effects, these are, I guess, being proposed for specific medical conditions. Maybe we should outline, or maybe I'll ask you to outline, what are the kind of use cases, I guess, for the broader kind of basket of psychedelics, compared to what are the traditional offerings for the conditions, and what are the shortfalls of them?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing to say is as you say, that a lot of the interest, particularly in terms of the research and the studies that are going on with psilocybin, is related to mood disorders. And a lot of the studies that we've looked at have primarily looked at what we describe as treatment-resistant depression. And that, by definition, is depression that has not responded to at least 2 standard treatments. Okay, so that's really where a lot of the studies have been showing. But the feeling is, potentially, psilocybin may be useful, and I did a little bit of a deep dive into this, but in not only depression, but PTSD, alcohol dependence, anorexia, even potentially in end of life palliative care. There's been lots of theories and postulations around that. So it's an area that potentially is broader than we think. But if we focus firstly on mood disorders, I mean, Matt, you'll know this as well from your clinical work, but they're fairly limited in terms of the options that are available to patients. So if anyone is suffering from significant mood disorders, whether that's anxiety or persistent low mood, really, in terms of medication, most people reach for their SSRIs, and they're your kind of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, they have been proven to work, and that's an important point to say, is that we're not in any way suggesting that these are not effective and that they don't help people, because that's patently not true. However, I think it's also fair to say they've got significant setbacks or limitations, perhaps. So, known to have quite significant side effects. They can take a while to work. So patients can often see that they can take sort of 4 to 6 weeks to work. They can also have quite significant discontinuation symptoms. And by that, I mean, when people want to come off them, that process can be quite difficult. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on SSRI usage, but certainly I've seen all of those things, and I would certainly agree with that from an experiential point of view.
Yeah, I think I think they are an effective drug. It's something we definitely use a lot as GPs, and I think it's interesting that there's so many different offerings in terms of SSRIs. There are other forms of antidepressants as well. It's probably worth mentioning as well, I guess, for treatment-resistant depression, that there's, for the seriously unwell patients who are inpatients, then there's electroconvulsive therapy, which is not really known so much about in the public. Maybe some people think that it's, that's a treatment of the past, but is definitely an effective treatment. But the obvious shortfalls of that, are obvious. You need to be an inpatient, you need several months, repeated sessions. There are complications of that. And there's also huge stigma around that type of treatment at the moment. So in terms of new offerings or new medications, for example, if psychedelics were effective, then, or even if they're just effective for a small cohort of those patients, then that has huge potential, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think on that point, and we'll touch upon this, it's potentially why there's so much investment in this area in terms of financial backing, because I think clinicians and probably the general public for a long time now have been thinking about trying to find a better treatment or more options for this, because the stats would attest to that. The sheer number of people who have mental health problems both in the UK and around the world has a massive impact in so many different ways. And in terms of novel therapies, there are other ones around there. So it's not just the psychedelics. There's transmagnetic stimulation, which is we may touch upon in a future episode. I don't know. There's also probiotics, and the feeling that some studies have shown that probiotics might help. And then look, I think we should probably mention the importance of therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectic therapy or whatever various form of therapy, which undoubtedly can be hugely beneficial, and science and research has proven that.
Yeah, no, good to, I guess important to round that up. Just coming back to the definition of hallucinogenics, I found kind of interesting, because the definition of hallucinogenics or psychedelics for a lay term is that these are drugs that cause hallucinations or expansion of consciousness. And I find it interesting, the proposed use cases for these is now much broader than that confined by this definition. The idea of being able to treat depression, PTSD, anxiety, OCD is fascinating. But we should probably then move on to our review of whether or not these actually work, and looking at the research, maybe some of the investment that's going on.
Yeah, I feel like you've dealt with the sciencey part here, so I'll take the nitty gritty of the research and give a broad overview of this. As we've alluded to, there's quite a lot of research going on with this, and the studies that are sort of popping up every month or so are probably more frequent than that. I think it's probably worth mentioning, and this hit the media a few months ago and got a bit of traction, was featured in a lot of the sort of mainstream media. But the largest trial to date, and it is important to mention, it's funded by a company called Compass Pathways, who have huge investment into psychedelics. So it is within their interest to, investigate this and prove that it works, essentially. So they did this study that was 22 sites across 10 countries in Europe and also the USA. Between 2019 and 2021, they got over 200 participants with treatment-resistant depression. And essentially, they blinded them. So what that means is neither the patient nor the researcher, the person who's running the research, knew what dose was being given, but patients could be given either 25 milligrams, 10 milligrams, or 1 milligram doses of this main man-made formulation of psilocybin called Comp 360. So in this example, they are using that 1 milligram dose as a control dose. It's a subtherapeutic dose. The way they looked at this, so the participants were assessed on the severity of their depressive symptoms the day before the psilocybin was administered, and then followed up at sort of day 2, week 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12. So for 12 weeks in all. So what this study showed was that the psychedelic effects lasted between 6 to 8 hours. During this time, a therapist was in the room to provide some psychological support. There were some adverse effects reported, so headaches, nausea, thoughts around suicide as well. So clearly that's significant. But in terms of the results and in terms of what the study showed, it really did show that the change from baseline to week 3 in terms of a depressive score was significantly better with the 25 milligram dose than with the control dose, the 1 milligram dose. There didn't seem to be huge significance between the 10 milligram dose and the 1 milligram dose. So it seemed as though that 25 milligram dose was the one where potentially some effect was being found.
There's so many pitfalls in that study, there aren't there? I mean, there's the idea of having a therapist deliver therapy while essentially critically appraising a medication. There's so many kind of variables there that can confound the evidence, let alone the fact that it's the kind of big pharma who's arranging the study to validate the medication that they're proposing is, I guess, fraught with problems in itself, isn't it?
It really is, and you're right. And interestingly enough, just a couple of days ago, there was a paper in the British Medical Journal which actually addressed exactly those limitations. And it is worth bearing in mind that, firstly, we don't have any long-term data on this. So it's all very well saying, well, the adverse effects were a bit of nausea, headaches, whatever, but we don't have a long-term safety profile in terms of psilocybin. And then also they touched upon this term referred to as functional unblinding. I don't know, are you familiar with that? It's something I had to do a little bit of reading about.
I think it's really interesting, this idea, the concept of everything's blind, so nobody knows which medication they're getting, but it's confirmation that you've not received the placebo when you start seeing shapes moving. You go, it's confirmation that actually, oh yeah, I'm definitely in the treatment arm of this study, and then the implications of that are complex, but how that can affect the results is really tricky, isn't it? And it's actually a huge problem with these specific medications, because there's this isn't kind of cancer therapy where you may not have symptoms. These are medications that cause quite profound experiences, and there's no way of limiting that. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and I think always whenever we're looking at this kind of research, it's important to look at it from both sides, look at the quality of the evidence, and that's hopefully what we'll try and do as we go on with this series. I mean, it's something we could talk about for hours, but I'm just conscious I wanted to get your opinion, Matt, on the other side of psilocybin. I mean, we haven't touched upon it hugely, but if anyone knows anything about Joe Rogan and his podcasts, he's always talking about psilocybin, but not so much from the medical side of things. This is more the microdosing. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that and a bit of an explainer potentially.
Gosh, I mean, lifting up the hatch and discovering what's underneath here was mind blowing for me. It's a big business, and particularly in the States, it seems this is we're talking about, yes, we should make a distinction here that this isn't for kind of therapeutic gains. This is more for kind of health optimization,
productivity, I guess.
Yeah, recreational use for kind of productivity and health optimization. Big use in Silicon Valley has been documented. I think I read a Wired magazine interview from 2016 where they were interviewing various software engineers, biologists, mathematicians, all reporting various things, that it induces a flow state, that it aids their lateral thinking, encourages a more kind of empathetic interpersonal relations. There were lots of claims, and one of them described how they were literally grinding up and blending their own mushroom, the mushrooms. I can't remember if they bought them or grew them, blending them up and then kind of pressing them into these gel capsules and taking a capsule with a herbal tea in the morning, almost as a kind of caffeine alternative. Which sounds totally bonkers, but yeah, it's a big industry now, particularly in the States. I must outline that it is completely still illegal, other than it in the state of Oregon, where I think it's been decriminalized. But it's a huge industry. As part of my research, I've got a friend who has dabbled in this, and I picked his brains on why he did it and what the effects were. Asking him why, he was saying that he was having difficulty concentrating, and at times he felt conversely hyper-focused, and that he was just worrying about things that seemingly didn't matter to him, and complained that his mood was erratic, and that he was searching for some calm and some clarity. So quite a lot of different symptoms and things going on in his brain there. But he had, again, this is anecdotal, he seemingly had quite a positive experience from this. Shockingly, he was able to obtain this kind of stuff. I won't go into details because, medically, legally, I don't want to get in trouble, but it was shockingly easy how he was able to do this. But he describes having a definite uptick in his daily energy. He says that the effect definitely wasn't huge, but he felt more optimistic, a bit generally lighter, and that he was thinking more clearly. He describes specific things like when looking at artwork, he felt a deeper sense of sensitivity, a more kind of emotional acuity when listening to music. And he summarised it by saying it was quite difficult to quantify, which I thought was interesting. So all quite vague, quite subjective, and difficult to prove, I guess, is the underlying statement. If you'll forgive me for nattering on here, I did do some research, looking at some of the papers about microdosing. And there was one quite compelling paper published in Nature in 2022. It was an observational study looking at almost 1,000 microdoses compared to almost 200 non-dosing participants for 30 days. And that it concluded that they found a small to medium-sized improvement in mood and mental health that were generally consistent across age, gender, and presence of mental health concerns. And there's many other, reports, anecdotal evidence of people subjectively benefiting from these kind of microdosing experiments. However, there was another paper, again published in Nature in the same year, which looked a bit more at objective measures, and that it did report that people felt happier, a bit more creative. This was a smaller study of 35 patients, but they even found some EEG changes, so some altered brainwaves from those who had taken the active substance rather than the placebo. But they did a gamut of tests, and essentially they didn't find any objective evidence that there is improvements in creativity, well-being, or cognitive function, which was a bit kind of damning in some ways. But I would say this was a small study, and that it was definitely subject to this kind of functional unblinding, because the users who felt subjectively more happy and more creative were confirmed as those who'd kind of sussed it out to a certain extent. They'd realised that they were taking the active substance. So whether or not you can then take that forward as evidence, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess it moves us on quite nicely to the safety profile and safety considerations of this. And I think just to offer this sort of other side of the coin, there are, as you'll know from sort of years of clinical practice, there are patients that you remember fairly well. And I've certainly got a couple of situations working overseas where people have come in psychotic, and this has been a result of taking high doses. That's worth mentioning, but high doses of magic mushrooms, of psilocybin, and this is a completely recognized risk of this, that the risk of unmasking psychosis and causing really significant mental health problems. There's obviously also the risk of accident or misadventure when you are tripping, as it were. So really, really important, I guess, to offer the other side of this and say again that long-term safety profile, we just don't know that yet. The studies have really only been since more recently, 2018 or so. So we don't know whether there are any long-term implications. It's probably just important in this section just to offer that disclaimer, or that really important takeaway point, that whilst this is interesting stuff, and I do personally think that in a few years this may well become a treatment option, we're not suggesting here that anybody suddenly stops their medication that they're taking, their SSRIs or whatever it is, to do this. Important to mention that it's, as we've talked about, it's illegal. The studies are ongoing, and we'll wait and see. It's an interesting discussion to have, but certainly nothing proven conclusively yet.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, listen to this as a list of documented side effects. So hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, the inability to integrate mystical experiences into our mundane lives, which they call spiritual bypass, and deteriorating psychological health following psychological therapy and persisting after psychological therapy with hallucinogens. I mean, there's some pretty scary stuff here. This isn't just like a bad trip. There's some pretty shocking stuff here. I was also quite disturbed to read about reports of abuse of vulnerable subjects while under the influence of psychedelics, particularly in kind of treatment settings. It's quite a few kind of reports of that around the world, which is obviously quite shocking. But I think, yeah, it's right to kind of note that there is, how do I frame it? There's an ambivalent potential with these kind of powerful active substances. There's this ambivalent potential for positive and negative experiences, and I guess it's in no way is it easy to predict the outcome, particularly in these higher doses. And I was also shocked to learn of some of the more kind of established podcasts that I'm aware of. We're kind of talking about these heroic doses. So there's these microdosing and these treatment doses, and these people have claimed there's heroic doses, and just the wording of that, I really, kind of recoiled at. The idea of anyone being a hero from taking a huge dose is insane, and is definitely not the way I think it should be framed or experimented with.
And I think there's a risk here as well, is that, as more research is published, there's more press coverage in the media about the effects, particularly with microdosing, that any of us, I feel it all the time, that lack of concentration, lack of motivation, the feeling fatigued, feeling as though you can't focus on something. It's modern life in a lot of ways, particularly when you've got two young children. But the feeling is that, you might think, right, I need to do something about that. The only answer or the best option is to get hold of these and try these. And if it's not done in the right way, if it's not done safely, then we run the risk of all the side effects and adverse effects that you've mentioned.
All of the research that's being done needs to be done in a controlled way, and the fact that it's still few and far between means that people are just experimenting themselves, which is not a good way to go. Mike, I want to ask you. We're closing towards the end of this conversation, but I want to take you on a bit of a tangent and ask you a question. And this might seem tangential, but what do you think that the assassinated President JFK has to do with this particular topic?
That's an interesting topic. Weirdly enough, as you said it rang a bell somewhere. But is it something to do with, was Lee Harvey Oswald under the influence of magic mushrooms at the time? Was that the feeling?
Very good. Very, very. I'm impressed that you kind of thinking on your feet there. But no, that's not the string I'm pulling on. So his nephew, RFK Jr., who has recently been appointed by Donald Trump as the head of the Department of Health in the States. Do you know much about this man?
Unfortunately, yes, I do. I've read a little bit about his views on vaccines and fluoride in water. He's got a worm in his brain as well, I believe.
So, of his many, interesting, potentially controversial views, he is a keen proponent. He's a keen believer in psychedelics and them being legal. And as part of the rabbit holes that I went down, there's a YouTube interview with the man himself, telling this story about following the tragic suicide of his wife, and how one of his 6 children seemed like a happy kid, but was often getting in fights in hockey matches, got into boxing, was quite a good competitive boxer, it sounds, and then went off on some Amazon trip and floating down the river, and then got in with some shaman and had a hallucinogenic experience, and then described him being a changed man ever since. And his kind of observation of that was him then coming home and taking out the trash one day, which was seemingly quite trivial, but this is the evidence that he was giving. But he's a believer that these should be legal, and that his anecdotes, he goes on to kind of say he's got friends with severe depression, PTSD, OCD who tried psilocybin, ayahuasca, and it's transformed their lives. It was his words from his own mouth. I think this is really interesting because he is now the head of the health department in the most powerful country in the world, which is already a kind of booming economy. We talked about these kind of microdosing things. So I'm curious to see where this goes, and whether this is kind of opening Pandora's box. Um, but yes, it's an exciting time to be kind of studying this, and to seeing where this, where the legislation now goes.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was going to ask you actually, just to finish, what your view, having done this research, whether that changed your opinion, I guess, on where you think this will go, or whether it's a good thing that there's more interest in this medication, or whether actually reading some of the more shady, negative aspects of this have maybe changed your opinion the other way.
I I have an open mind on this. I think there's a lot of oversimplification. I think things like depression is not, is not a single entity. It's a different beast for different patients. There's different reasons why people are depressed, and I think the responses to treatment is going to be different. But if there's new medications that have kind of novel implications, then I'm interested, and I'd like to see studies done properly, independent of big pharma. But I have an open mind, and I'm keen to see where it goes. And it's interesting that there seems to be a bit of a groundswell of support for this now. And like I said, I'm curious to know where this goes with RFK now being the head. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, I certainly take on board all of the limitations that have been highlighted. And I do think that there are really important considerations to think about. But what I would say is it does feel a little bit like that argument of, well, there's no long-term data about side effects is all well and good, but you could level that at any novel treatment, and it feels a little bit as though we're finding reasons to put it down where, and I fully accept the limitations of the data we've got, but I feel as though there may well be something there. Now, whether it's transferable to frontline medicine, I don't know, or whether this microdosing community will take over and it will just be used in a sort of productivity way, or abused in other ways, I guess. I don't know. But I think, again, open mind is the right way to look at this.
Fantastic.
Anyway, we have talked for 40 minutes. Matt, this was really good fun. I hope everyone who's listening has enjoyed it. It's at this point I should probably say like and subscribe if you have done. If you haven't, then you don't have to.
Cheers, Mike. Bye bye.